It's my pleasure to be here and to talk a little bit about the future. My background is not so technological. I'm more interested in the social and cultural dynamics behind technology. The magazine that we started 25 years ago called Wired was really about the cultural consequences of technology. And so what I want to talk about is some large-scale trends. And if I could have the slides, that'd be great. And these large-scale trends that I'm talking about, I'm calling inevitables. And I use that word in a special way, meaning that in the same way that we would look at the history of the light bulb, there was 32 inventors besides Thomas Edison who invented the light bulb at the same time. So that light bulb was going to happen no matter what. The specific aspects of that light bulb, whether it was AC or DC, whether it was a vacuum tube, what was inside, those were unpredictable. We can't talk about those. That's inherently unpredictable, but we knew that the light bulb was going to come. And so what I'm talking about is these technological trends that are as inevitable as a light bulb is, that I think will help us understand what's going to happen in the next 20 years, 10 years, and that's the time scale that I want to talk about, is what are the inevitable technologies coming in the next 10 or 20 years that we're pretty sure will be here and that you'll have to deal with. And these are high-level trends, and they are often mostly propelled at the scale of the light bulb rather than the specific about which company is going to win. I'm not talking about predicting who's going to win, whether it's Apple or something else. I'm talking about the large-scale form that our society is headed into. So the fundamental trend, you might want to think about the fundamental trend that I'm going to talk about, that is the basis of most of the other trends that I'm going to talk about this morning, is the fact that we have a shift that's been going on for 25, 30, 40 years, and will go into the future. And that is this shift from hierarchical structures to network structures. Okay? That's been going on. It's not news to anybody. But I think what we don't appreciate is the fact that it's penetrating. That shift is penetrating to everything that we're doing. It's been going on for 30 years. It will continue to go on to another 30 years. And the original hierarchy, the way we could do things in a world where there was very little information, it was very effective to have a structure of command and control. That was the most effective way to get something done without a lot of information. It's a very secure way. It's a very effective way. It's very certain, but it was also slow. The network structure, in contrast, is chaotic, it's loose, but it's very, very fast. And what we're seeing is that these qualities, again, are present not just in institutions, but actually now being augmented, propelled, accelerated, enhanced by technology. The technologies that we're talking about of information, computers, allow us to do networks much deeper, much cheaper, much faster than we could ever do before. And so that structure has now become powerful for all kinds of things. The hierarchy was centralized, closed, and was very good with commands. It was very effective in a world without a lot of information. In a world with a lot of information that changes very fast, this new structure of networks is decentralized, it's open, it's peer-to-peer. That presents many opportunities, but many challenges as well. And so what we're seeing is that these shift from hierarchical command structures to network structures has been accelerating and will continue to go into the next 3 or 4 decades. We're just at the beginning of how far we can move this into this network decentralized kind of technology. And the networks that I'm talking about are not just about the online world, okay? eBay is a very networked way to do a retail store. Okay, so you took something that was a very simple structure of a retail store, and then eBay was a way of using network structures to do it. That's one step, of course. But if you think about Uber and Lyft and the new on-demand ways of doing a taxi service or transportation service, that's another. So it's not just a service now, it's a product. It actually is affecting physical things. So the network has moved into the physical things. There's also crowdfunding. So the financial world is also being affected by this shift to using technology to make a decentralized version. And even organizations themselves, the very nature of a company is also being transformed and decentralized and peer-to-peer because of this technology. Not only that, but this culture at large is being affected in this shift. We have an entire mass of citizens who are communicating in a network peer-to-peer fashion. And of course, that leads us to the fact that we can have government. The government itself will also undergo this same shift. So this shift to decentralization is not new, is continuing, but is being accelerated by technology to affect almost all aspects of our lives, from products to services to finance to the organization, institutions itself, to the very society and the government. All these things are being affected and will continue to be affected more by this technology that we're making. And this shift is really the fundamental shift underneath it all, because talking about governance, it's impossible to govern institutions and citizens that are networked if the government itself is not also mirrored in the same way. You can't use a hierarchical structure to govern networks. You have to be networked yourself. So I want to talk about this process. There's 10 processes that come out of this basic shift. And the 10 processes I give a verb to. I give one. And the first one that I want to talk about is this idea that, of course, everything is changing. We know that everything is changing. But more important, I think, more important is to understand that processes are what we want to pay attention to. Things are no longer nouns. It's not like we have a physical thing or an artifact. Everything is best understood as a process of becoming, of changing. And you want to focus on the process. And so, in a certain sense, a company or an organization is really not a thing. It's a process that generates products or services. In the same way that we can think of an iPhone itself is really not a physical object. It's more of a subscription that you're constantly upgrading over time. It's the process of throwing off telecommunication that you are purchasing. You're actually not purchasing an object. And so this focus on process and verbs is part of this shift and what technology is allowing us to do. So we have networked communication chips that we put into everything. They're connected to each other. That makes everything very liquid, fluid, very much of a process. So we take some of the attributes of software and we have to bring it to even physical things. Just like software is constantly being upgraded, even physical things will also be upgraded. And I think it's best for us to view them as processes. So process actually becomes more valuable than the products. If you want to focus on making a process that throws off, it generates the products rather than focusing on products. So that's the basic process-oriented that this new technology gives us. And as you make something, you want to understand that you actually should be focusing on making a process that generates those products or services. So opening is another verb, another process-oriented view, and the technology that it can liberate, I will take an example and go into some detail, with the idea of transportation. So you've heard of Uber and Lyft, and the way that works, of course, is that it takes the idea of communication and the network model to transportation. Now, of course, we've had many kinds of networked transportation services in the past. A taxi is basically a network service. You don't own a car, so you you wave down a taxi. That's kind of decentralized. But we've had jeepneys, which is another form of transportation that you don't own, but the difference is that there's along a defined route, and they can take more than one person. And then we've had school buses, which are very defined, and they take a lot of people. Those are all kind of old models. But what we've done with this new technology and the increased decentralization to it is that we've opened it up to something like Uber, where you employ more than just a designated taxi. You can have anybody who wants to drive can now drive. So that's a new twist to this decentralization brought about by technology. But there's other things. You could actually have a network of cars that are available for someone to use. So rather than have a car and a driver, you just have a car. So this is zip cars. So that's another way of decentralizing and peer-to-peering the idea of transportation. But you could have another idea of a Lyft line, which is that you have, like an Uber, anybody can drive, but they can pick up more than one person. And if you pick up a lot of people, it's like a jeepney, you decrease the fare. So there's another alternative to decentralizing, using technology to decentralize and make this technology more peer-to-peer. Or there is this called a ride, sidecar, and there they do another twist with the technology. They say, I'm going to offer how much I'm willing to pay a taxi to take me somewhere. So it's a reverse auction. So you're using more technology in the peer-to-peer way to decentralize it. And the number of options that we have are really, really large. So here's another called ride that anybody can offer their car. So you're not driving, you say, I will volunteer my car. If my car is not being used, someone else can use it. So there's yet another way in the transportation sphere to use this technology and decentralize it. And here's rideshare, which is where you're driving somewhere and you're going to go on the route anyway, but you use this technology to allow other people to ride with you, and you get paid. So that's a 10th way to do this. And there's other ways of favoring and helping drivers decide which route they want to take. And there's things like Waze, which is another app that helps drivers find the optimal route. So what I'm suggesting is if you just take this one single example of transportation, there's almost hundreds of ways that we're using technologies to decentralize them, to make them more peer-to-peer, part of this long-term shift. And these examples that I'm showing you right now are probably just at the beginning. There are probably 100 other ways to move this using technology to take advantage of the fact that we can do things in a peer-to-peer way that we could not do before. These are kind of called mesh companies, and these are just there's 9,000 of them that someone has counted up, and these are just 4 different sectors, and each one of those is a little icon picture, just to give you a sense of how much energy there is now into exploring any domain that you want, whether it's transportation or advertising or healthcare. We're just at the beginning of understanding what we can do in terms of moving this away from a top-down model to something that is mostly being driven from peer to peer, from the bottom. That's just the beginning of what we're doing. And coming back to transportation, you can actually use the same communication peer-to-peer to actually make an automobile. This is an automobile that was made by the users. They designed it. A bunch of car enthusiasts use the technology to coordinate, to design the car, and of course they also funded the car. Rather than having a big company give the finance for the car and hire designers, the group, the crowd, used this new technology to work together, to collaborate, to design and manufacture and fund that automobile. So the idea of using the crowd, the collective, the network to fund things has become very, very powerful because it takes out some of the barriers of having to go with your crazy idea to somebody and ask permission to get funded and probably not get funded versus going to people who would want the thing that you wanted and having them fund it itself. So Kickstarter is one example of the most famous one, but there are actually 1,800 other platforms that are using crowdfunding. And the amount of money so far is $18 billion, which is not insignificant for creating a new model of financing. And that's just the beginning, as you can see where that curve is going. So many large companies are using crowdfunding as a way of doing market research, even though they don't need the money. They're interested in how somebody can use this system as a way to see if they really want, people really want what they're making. Because if people are volunteering money, that means that they would find it valuable. So the next step in that, again, networked version of technology is to do crowd-funded equity, where instead of people contributing together to fund a project, they're actually going to fund a company. They're actually going to have shares in that company in the way you might go public. But here is a very fast way, a very decentralized way to have people become owners of an organization that's going to be a process of making new things. That's the extent in which this kind of technology can go. Obviously, if we keep pushing this idea of how far can this power go, we can imagine a kind of money that is peer-to-peer. And that's what we call cryptocurrency, the most famous being Bitcoin. It's a peer-to-peer currency that does not have a central hierarchical bank involved. And that's sort of famous now because Bitcoin was used to keep anonymous transactions in the sale of drugs and others on a black market. But that's actually not so important. There are hundreds of other cryptocurrencies, all different ways of doing this. But the important thing that they all have in common is not the fact that they can be anonymous, because that's a distraction. The important thing is that they run off of a peer-to-peer accounting system called the blockchain. And the blockchain is a way of making sure that there's no fraud or double spending without a central bank. You do it entirely by the fact that everybody is sharing a public ledger. It's a very, very powerful technology that many people in Silicon Valley see as a basis for many new products and services, because you are decentralizing money, and that's very, very powerful. So forget about the anonymity part of Bitcoin and focus on the fact that the blockchain is a fundamental new way to do things like, accounting, contracts, any kinds of things that involve money. So money is no longer about value, it's a type of communication. And the same things that you can do with communication, like share it, collaborate, track it, broadcast it, annotate it, you can now do with money. So you can actually follow a dollar, a particular dollar, and have that dollar be annotated as it goes through the entire system, because it's all publicly accounted for. So you can annotate money in a way you couldn't think of doing before. Just like we can now annotate words, that's what happens with the blockchain and the Bitcoin technology. So this is a very large thing happening. Don't be distracted by the fact that it was used in an anonymous way by drug traffickers, and focus on the fact that this technology fundamentally is changing how we understand what money is. All these things that I've been talking about, the way that they're open is that when you make this kind of a network, you make what they call an API, which allows people to participate. So when you make a network, it becomes more powerful when you create an API that will allow anyone to participate easy. So that's what you're trying to do. That's what an API is. When you're making things in a government sense, what you want to do is you want to have APIs that encourage people to participate in some ways, often ways that you cannot imagine yourself. You let them figure out how they want to participate, but by making it easy for them to participate, which is what we call an API. So that's the things like Bitcoin has an API, Facebook, all these platforms have APIs. That's what makes them powerful, is that they're allowing the users and the network itself to participate and make and invent new things. So becoming and opening are two processes. The next process I want to talk about is called sharing. And again, what we can say, sharing has happened for a long time, but what this technology is allowing us to do is to increase the amount of sharing that's now possible. We've had personal technology, and now we're going from the me to the we, to social technology. And I think the sharing meter, we've just started. We're just still at the very beginning of how much we can share. And what we've found out is that there's almost nothing that we can think of that can't be made better and more powerful by sharing. And I think anything that can be shared will be shared. So we're discovering is that when you give attention to something, influence comes back. And so wherever attention flows, money will follow. A lot of the people in new media are really concerned about where is the money coming from, how can we generate revenue? Well, from a study of many, many industries, we show that where attention flows, money will flow later. There's some kind of a delay, but I think what we have is an attention economy. We have a surplus of everything else that we can make. And the one scarcity that we have is our human attention. So that becomes more and more valuable. And so it's all about trying to harness the human attention, because that is the one scarcity. So I like to say is follow where people are paying attention to. Where do people pay attention to? They pay attention to YouTube videos or Vines, social media. That's where they're giving their attention to. It's not, unfortunately, to books. It's to other places. So if you follow where people are giving attention to, money follows there. I think the idea that right now we are reading email for free, that what we're going to change over is your attention is very, very valuable. I think we're going to get a point where you begin actually to charge to read someone's email. Someone will have to pay you to read your email because your attention is valuable. Right now, you're reading someone else's email at their request. There's no economics in that. Your attention is too valuable, so I think we're going to start to price your attention for reading email. People will pay to reach you. If you're more influential, you'll charge more. For some people, maybe your friends, you don't charge very much. The same thing we're going to have with ads. You should be paid directly for reading an ad. Not just some other company gets the money, but you should be getting money for reading an ad. And I think that's where we're going to see in advertising is going to move to a model where individual readers, audience, are paid directly for giving their attention to an ad. So people who are very influential and who can influence many people will have a higher ranking, and they'll be able to charge more for their attention and their influence. And I think sometimes we're actually getting to the thing where we'll calculate the lifetime effect of somebody would have. How much is it worth to pay them to read my ad? Because they are very influential. They influence friends, and the friends over a lifetime will influence others. So therefore, I'd be willing to pay them $5 to look at my ad. So we also pay people to create ads as well. We're seeing that already, that the American advertisers are having the users and the audience create the ads. So I'm suggesting is that even in the advertising, that itself can become networked. So we have peer-to-peer ad system. It's no longer just advertising agents creating ads, and they decide who gets to watch them. It's decentralized again. We're using this technology to decentralize it, to make it a peer-to-peer system where people are actually generating ads, being paid directly to look at the ads. And that old model of the hierarchical ad agency becomes less important. So another verb, another process is screening. I don't think we read anymore. I don't think we even watch. I think we screen things. Things are on the screen, and that action we call screening. It's not reading or watching. We used to be people of the book. Our culture was founded and centered on books, constitution, holy books, laws. They were all in a bound volume, and they became the center of our culture. We're now becoming people of the screen, and screens are everywhere. They're small, they're ubiquitous, they're huge on the side of buildings. They're now flexible. You can make them flexible. And there's even on windshields, airplanes, and there can be screenless displays as well. The point is that they're everywhere and they're cheap and they're becoming ubiquitous. We think of an e-book right now as kind of a piece of a flat board, but there's no reason why each of those pages on a book could not be a screen. Every page is a screen, and we could have an e-book that looks like a regular book because every page is a screen that would respond and change. So we have, there used to be the second screen, now we have the third screen. So people are sitting, they'll have one screen, they have a phone, they have a laptop, they have a big screen. There's a whole ecosystem of screening. And what we know about screening as a difference from books is that books were fixed. They were precise. The words in them were precise. And the authors are where we get the idea of authority. So that cultural dynamic that came from books is no longer there. We're now moving towards the network, which is fluid and messy and open. And instead of having authority give us the truth, we have to assemble it ourselves as we go through the web. And so this idea of screening, when we get things on the screen, it affects our culture. It affects where authority is. It's not just about the fact that we move things from a book to a screen. It's the fact that we are changing our culture by the fact that we are living on the screens, but that we're screening things. And so these have consequences. And I think one of the things we want to understand is that as we make more and more screens, that will change how we treat truth, authority, veracity. All these kinds of things fall out from the fact that we are now living on the screen. Generating is another action that's encouraged by this shift in technology. It's a world where copies are very free. So anything that can be copied on the internet will be copied. If you bring something up to the internet and it touches the internet, it will be copied indiscriminately. Anything that can be copied will be copied over and over and over again. So copies become ubiquitous, but they become cheap and free. As we know, with music and books, you can make a copy. You can find a copy of a movie very easily. You can find a copy of software. The copy itself is no longer very valuable. So what becomes valuable, the only thing that becomes valuable in this internet of everything world is things that cannot be copied. So what can't be copied? Well, there's some intangibles of things that can't be copied, like trust. You can't copy trust. You can't go to the trust store and buy trust or download trust or store trust on your hard disk. You have to actually generate trust in the exchange with people. And there are other things that have to be generated in the same way. So authentication is something that you cannot copy. So there's two different copies of a piece of software. One of them is authenticated. You know for sure that it came from the source that is reliable, that doesn't have any malware in it. So therefore, you're likely to pay extra money for that copy versus getting the free copy on the internet. And you're actually not paying for the software, because the software is basically the same. You're paying for the authentication, that it's authentic. That can't be copied, and that's what you're paying for. The same thing with immediacy. So you can eventually get a copy of that movie. If you wait long enough, you can get a copy of that music for free if you want to wait until it comes out. But if you really want a band or a movie right now, as soon as it's released, you may be willing to pay for it. And there you're not paying for the copy of it, you're paying for the immediacy of it, because the copy is the same, whether you wait or get it for free. The same thing with personalization. Again, taking the music idea is, you can find the copy of Beethoven's Fifth somewhere online for free, but if you wanted to have a version of it that was custom tuned to the acoustics of your living room, that personalization would be something you might be willing to pay for. So you're not really, again, paying for the music, you're paying for the personalization, which cannot be copied. In that same way of interpretation, free software, you can get the free software anywhere you want, but you may be willing to pay for the interpretation, the help, the manual to it. The software is free, the manual costs, because you are paying for something that can't be copied. How to use it in your own situation. Findability is another intangible that people would pay for. I think Amazon, one of the values of Amazon is, even if things were free, you might still go to Amazon because it will help you find something. It will recommend a particular, say, if you're interested in this, you should also look at this. That findability becomes valuable and you're willing to pay for, even though the thing itself that you're going to get, you might be able to get for free, you're paying for the findability of it. So all these things, immediacy, personalization, there's others. The point about these is that they cannot be copied easily. They have to be generated in the exchange. And that becomes the economy for this internet world. Because even physical things are going in the same direction, as I'll explain. So interacting is another verb, is another new way that we're paying attention to this technology. As you know from the movie Minority Report, in the future, people aren't going to be just typing in front of a little keyboard. They're using their whole bodies to conduct information. That's actually a movie that I worked on, and that was one of our ideas was that we would use our whole body and not just our fingertips to communicate. And so this idea of opening up, using the technology to open up our whole body and all our senses to communicate with machines and each other. So Iron Man was another movie. Again, Hollywood being ahead of showing how we were going to communicate with our computers and our devices in the future, using our hands and standing up, and our voices, of course, but even our eyes. And so what we're discovering is that anything that we make that has a screen on it, that screen is going to look back. Every screen is going to look back at us. And so the Galaxy, Samsung Galaxy, I think 4S, has eye tracking software. So it knows where you're looking, where on the screen you're looking. And more importantly, with the new software being developed at MIT and other places, it can tell what your mood is. It can tell whether you're confused, whether you are perplexed, whether you're happy or distracted. And it can, therefore, in some ways respond to your own use of it. So this is eye tracking software that can tell in aggregate where people are paying most attention to on a web page. And therefore, they can then adapt that. It can then modify what you see based on your own use of it, how your eyes and your face describe your reaction to it, the screen itself is going to adapt back to the way that we use it. It's a two-way conversation. And emotion traction, today, the state of the art is that your screen can identify all these emotions. It can say, oh, you're baffled, you're perplexed, oh, you're totally mesmerized. These are all emotions that the screen and the software can now detect in the laboratory, and that will move into our devices. And so we will have an adaptive response to the things that we're watching. So the big news these days is these goggles that make virtual reality. And I think what is important about this is that the strength of the presence that you feel inside this is very, very powerful. I have tried these, and I have to say it's amazing how powerful that is, because it takes over a part of your brain that is very primitive. So even though your brain is telling you that you're just standing in a room, the inner reptilian part of your brain is telling you, no, 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 you're on a ledge, and you're going to fall over any minute now, because that's what your eyes see, and you're totally believable. And this is a very, very, very powerful technology. The Facebook bought Oculus, and there's many others in this space. But the important thing is that it's not just going to be about games. I mean, obviously, games is going to be a big thing, where you totally, totally believe that you're inside that. And they have little cages and stuff so you don't hurt yourself, or a ring. It's a little ring that keeps you up so you don't fall over. But there are people working with right now where they do underwater exploration and going to places that you don't want a human to go, and you totally feel that you are there. It's just as real as if you were there. And that's very, very powerful in education and war and surgery, where you're able to either do things remotely or even have an augmented view of the human body while you're fixing somebody. You can actually see an overlay, an augmented reality is what we call it. And there's a couple of examples where they actually can do a 3D projection into space where every person is outside is seeing it in 3D using lasers. So this idea of augmenting what we see even without goggles and voice, we're increasing the variety of ways that we interact with our devices, and everything that we do has to be interactive. If it's not interactive, it doesn't work. I mean, there was a great story a friend told me about his daughter who encountered an old-style TV at someone's house, and she was very perplexed because she said it was like it was broken because there was no way to interact with it. There was no mouse. There was no device. She said it was only showing stuff, and so therefore in her eyes it was broken because there was no interaction with the device. And I think that's where we're going to, is whatever you're making, we have to emphasize the fact that interaction is paramount. We do have brain-computer interfaces. They do work. I have tried this. It does work. It doesn't work very well, but it does work. So you can control a computer, do simple commands just by thinking. But it doesn't look very cool. Nobody really want to walk around wearing one of these. But of course, that technology will keep improving over time. And for some people who are disabled, this is a huge lifesaver. So this is one of those technologies that will continue on the edges until it becomes really, really powerful. But that is happening now. So flowing is another verb I want to emphasize. Again, these things have been happening for 20 years, and they're going to happen another 20 years. That the metaphor that you want to understand about the internet is that no matter what business you're in, whether it's government or any business, you're now in a data business. It's all about the data and the flow of data. Okay? It's data about your customers becomes almost as valuable as your customers themselves. This is what the big Google and Facebooks have understood, that the data about their customers is probably more valuable than actually the customers and their business. And you want to keep data moving all the time. Data that doesn't move, that's stopped, that's dead, that's stored is not valuable. You want to have data that's always moving and being linked, and that's part of the challenge, is to keep the data moving, useful, doing stuff. I call it not storage, but movage. And we've seen a whole progression of the first generation of computers was about imitating the office and files and desktops and folders. And then the second one that we've been in has been about the web and pages and links and tags. But now we are into a third age of computing, and it's about streams and the tag and the cloud. It's about flows. It's much more fluid, much more ambiguous. And I think these streams of Twitter streams and Facebook streams, Instagrams, that's the new organizing principle that you have to understand. It's about real-time flows of things. It's not by static web pages. It's not by a static product. It's not a noun. It's a verb. And these things are flowing. And so you have to organize and devise the technologies that deal with streams and flows. And whereas the old model was about pages and the personal computer, and it was about today, and it was about me, the personal computer, and items, now we're talking about streams and the cloud, and it's about real time, right this second, and it's about collectively we, and it's about data. That's the new organizing metaphor for whatever business or technology that you're making. Tracking is the final, not the final, but the prominent verb. We're all tracking. So I was involved in starting the Quantified Self, which is this movement to try and track our own bodies. There are hundreds and hundreds of devices now where people are using to track anything you can imagine. And Apple released the new iWatch, or at least announced the iWatch. And it's one of thousands of different devices that are tracking our health, our biometrics, sleep patterns, glucose, activity, mood. Almost anything that we can imagine that can be tracked will be tracked and is being tracked. Scanadu is a new startup that allows you to touch your temple, and it can give you EKG brain waves and give you heart pressure, blood pressure, all kinds of things that you would want to imagine that the Star Trek tricorder could do. So that's what it's named after. In the Star Trek, they had a machine that would just wave over somebody and would diagnose them. That's what they're doing with this device right now. And that generates data like the iWatch, where we're taking all that data and using it to actually create our own personal profile of what we are spending our day doing, whether it's in activity, productivity, mood, memories. And over a lifetime of tracking, we actually can create something that gives us a basis for a baseline for when we are ill. Because it turns out that your normal is not my normal. That what is normal for you can only be determined by tracking your vitals all the time. And it turns out that it's not going to be the same as the person sitting next to you. Therefore, when you're sick, you have a very powerful data set to do personalized medicine. And that's where we're going with this, is that we can tailor medicine and treatments just to you because you've been tracking your health for so long that we can make that specific treatment for you and then also test you, because you'll continue to be tracked as you use this medicine to see whether it's actually working on you. So this gives us personalized medicine, which is a fundamental way, a different way of doing medicine than in the past, which is basically something has to work for everybody or else it doesn't get approved. Now we're saying a treatment can be tailored just for you specifically because we have enough data that you've been collecting about your own self to allow us to do that. And of course, the whole society is tracking us as well. Just as we track ourselves, We have 6 billion camera phones. Everything is being tracked. We're tracking each other. Companies are tracking us. We're voluntarily giving up information to those companies about where we are, what we're doing. That information is being used to give us some benefit. But the idea is that you can be sure that there'll be more tracking into the future. Tracking is not going to stop. It's inevitable. We're going to track more and more. And the question is, how do we make that tracking comfortable? How do we make it two-way, symmetrical, so that the people that track us, we know about them and can track them? That's really what it's going to come down to. The tracking is inevitable. Accessing is another big shift. Instead of owning things, why own anything? If you can access it. We see that with a car, going back to that car model. Why should you own a car when you can have an Uber or Zip, all these other options that a car comes to you when you need it? You don't have to own it. We see the same thing happening with Netflix. Nobody buys movies anymore. When you can have access to all the movies in the world, you pay a subscription. Or music with Spotify. You don't buy music. You subscribe and access the music, which you can find on your phone anywhere in the world, anytime. Amazon has an unlimited reading for ebooks. You don't need to buy an ebook. You just have access to all the books. And the same thing with games. So this model where access is more powerful than ownership is very, very disruptive, because ownership was sort of the foundation of capitalism, but now we are emphasizing the fact that we have access rather than ownership. Ownership almost becomes a liability. And so that's true of digital products, but I think it's also becoming true for other things. We have the demand economy, which is like you're just going to on-demand call for something that you don't own. So whatever you can think of, we have someone with a startup trying to do an Uber for that, whether it's drones, an Uber for drones, it's an Uber for parts, whatever it is. You can imagine a thing where you don't have to own anything. You're just soliciting and calling for things to be at your disposal when you need them and not before. And it's not just about digital stuff. Airbnb is a great example of a way to take physical things like a room, and you don't have to own it. You can just use it. Or Tech Shop, which is a place that you subscribe to tools. You don't own any tools. You just have this local place. They have every tool, and you go there to access the tools instead of owning the tools. So this goes even further into the 3D printing. You get a digital file. You print out something in a sense that you aren't really you are making it, but the idea of owning is not as important because it's on demand. You don't have to buy something in anticipation that you're going to use it. You just access it when you need it. And 3D printing, of course, is happening very, very fast. These are the first generation of samples. And what's important about 3D printing, I think, is the things that cannot be made except in 3D printing. Something like that, which has a real potential to revolutionize manufacturing. But I want to put it in the context that those files that move around, that people are swapping, are part of this decentralization, so that the manufacturing itself is no longer done just in factories. It's actually peer-to-peer. It's done spread out and decentralized. It's that same movement that we've been seeing for 30 years. We're going to see more and more of decentralizing everything. And even big things, bigger than that, can be printed with 3D. And so we have this idea of things that are physical behaving like software. That is the Internet of everything. When you think about the Internet of everything, understand that all these physical things can also be transmitted, printed out. They are little connected, and it is literally everything. That is the Internet of everything. It's all these objects that are behaving in the same way that software behaves, which means that they aren't owned, they're accessed, they change very rapidly, they need to be upgraded, they're a process. So what I'm trying to suggest is that it's very big and that you understand that physical things behave more like software does. Okay? So that's the Internet of Things. The last trend I want to talk about, I think is the most important one, which is about AI, Cognifying. It's about the fact that we are going to put little bits of AI into everything that we make. Anything that we had added electricity to in the past century, we're now going to add AI to. And we kind of know about Siri. That's just the very smallest hint of it. But I'll give you an example of current AI. This is something from Google. And all these pictures, the AI is writing the captions for those pictures. It's looking at a picture and saying, oh, that's 2 dogs playing in the grass. That, no human told it that. That's what the AI is doing. That's how smart it's got. And that's just last year. This year it's even smarter. Next year it'll be twice as smart. And so this is happening very, very fast. So AIs can actually substitute for X-ray diagnosis. They can do it better than humans can. They can do legal evidence for lawyers, going through documents and taking out evidence. They, of course, can fly a plane. And everybody here has AI in their car and their brakes, and they brake better than you do. Very soon, of course, they're going to drive a car better than you do. So the buzzword behind this is called deep learning. And the thing you want to remember about this is, of course, again, it's networks that are learning it, but it's happening very, very fast. This is a medical diagnostician from Watson that is already today better than the average doctor. And maybe not better than the best doctor, but this AI diagnostic thing is better than the average doctor. And for many people in the world who have an iPhone, this is better than no doctor. So that's the way we're going with this, is that this thing on a phone can diagnose you using pictures that you take better than no doctor if you have no doctor in India or Africa. Here it is. And this is already so good that it's better than the average doctor. That's how fast this is happening. And what Watson and Google are doing is they're going to sell this AI as a service, as a process. So you'll get it like web service or electricity. It's going to be on the grid. You just get as much IQ as you need to do something. You're not going to generate it yourself. You're going to be getting it from the cloud, because the more people that use it, the smarter it gets. The smarter it gets, the more people use it. So you have the same effect that we see, where it becomes very, very, very powerful. And that is the recipe, I think, for the next 10,000 startups, is that they're going to take some idea, whatever it is that we have today, and you're going to add AI to it. Just like a century ago, you took normal things and you added electricity. You made electric motors, you made electric tractors, you made all kinds of things electric light bulbs. That was the huge thing of the last century. This century is going to be adding AI to everything we do and making it smarter and really powerful. The tracking can be made more, we can take all that information and make sense of it with AI. We can do all the things that I just talked about, being powered by the fact that we can purchase the AI from the grid and using it to do new things. So, including, of course, robots. These are robots that are very smart and don't have to be programmed. You just show them what to do, and they will repeat what you do. They're that smart. And that's the old-style robots, and this is the new style that you can work next to, that can do packing just by showing it what has to be done. That exists today, and that's already happening. So, becoming, opening, sharing, screening, generating, interacting, flowing, tracking. These are the things that continue going. They've been operating for the past decades. They're going to continue more. They're inevitable. We're not going to stop the flowing, the tracking, etc. They're going to continue more and more. We're at the moment where these verbs and processes are more important. And of course, if you are in the government business, your own institutions have to reflect that. You have to operate in the very same mode that the rest of society is going. It has to be, the governance has to mirror what it is that we're trying to govern. And so I have a couple of suggestions from how things are made in this new arena of the network world. One is that when you are making something, you have to kind of do the hard work to make it simple in the beginning and then evolve. You can't make complicated things all at once. The way every one of these things I showed you have been made was they were made very small and simple that works first, and then you evolve the complexity. You cannot make complex things at the beginning. You can only make simple things and then add the complexity. Second thing is you show the thing, you prototype. Rather than making a white paper about it, you want to make something that works. A prototyping, a rapid prototyping. Even if it doesn't work well, you make something. That's the first step rather than making a paper about it. The second thing is you have to use the stuff yourself. And the programmers in Silicon Valley call it eating your own dog food, in the sense that you have to use the tools that you're using, that you're making. You want to use them yourself, because only that way can you really understand them. The fourth thing is that open standards, again, this idea of API, having openness is very robust. We know that from 20 years now, showing that open systems are more robust than closed systems. So you want to have an open API. You want to be as open with the standards as possible. And then fifthly, the idea is that there's a tendency to design systems around data, but you really want to design them, again, around the users rather than the data itself. Prohibition of technologies don't work. It's impossible to prohibit those things. These are inevitable. What we want to do is have a way for people to try them and then legislate based on what happens when they try it. You cannot prohibit things, particularly prohibiting them before they come. Like, say, prohibiting drones. It doesn't work. You want to work with them, have people try them out, make legislation based on what happens. Nudges work best rather than rules and laws. And laws are like versioning, like software. You want to have versions of them. You want to have them have timestamps so that they expire after a certain time. In this kind of environment, you want to have them be endlessly updated. And lastly, you're enabling the bottom. That's really where the power is. What I've tried to show through this talk is that this decentralized network peer-to-peer is really the most powerful way to approach making technology, because that is the technology itself. You know, it's really impossible to talk about where we're going, but it's going to be really hard to believe where we're going to go, because I know that 30 years ago, people claimed that computers would never be put inside a doorknob, but if you stay in a hotel, you have a computer inside your doorknob. We believe that now, but that was hard to believe. The computers would be so cheap, we'd put them into a doorknob. But that's what happened. So sometimes the impossible is happening more often. And you know, I think we're just at the beginning of the beginning. I've talked about things in a very rushed way, kind of giving you a sense of where they're going based on where they've been. But I want to emphasize is that we're just at day one. We're just at the beginning of all this stuff that's happening. If the next 20 years, if I think about it, I didn't mention any of the greatest products that have invented in the next 20 years. None of those ones that I talked about are probably going to be the most important ones. The most important ones haven't been invented yet. That means that you're not late. Okay, you're not late. So invent the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Kevin Kelly.
Sure.
I would like to open the room for questions right now.
Thank you. Okay. Hello.
Hello.
I'll speak in English, no problem.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation, Doctor. I just want, you know, it's very obvious that technology is moving so fast and evolving very, very rapidly. Just what are the control measures that are put in place to avoid misuse of data and personal privacy?
Yeah, personal privacy is a very central challenge for us now. I think the tracking is inevitable, but what we want to do is put into place procedures that will allow us to have a symmetry with knowledge, so that if I'm being tracked by some institution or company, I should have access to that information so I can check it to make sure it's correct. I want to be able to have people be accountable for it and with consequences if they do something that's incorrect. And I want the benefits to me to be very clear. So I think if you have accountability and transparency and benefits that are clear, people are going to be comfortable with that. If the tracking is done only one way, and I don't know who's tracking me, and I can't correct or even account for it, and I get no benefit or perceived benefit, that's very unacceptable. So I think we have to work with the fact that we're going to be tracking, and we want to have that symmetrical accountability to it, so that I have some power over changing, correcting, verifying, and that the benefits that I get are very clear to me and come to me. So that's where I would put our efforts. I think the idea of banning or prohibiting tracking or whatever is not going to work because it's inevitable. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. My question was with regards to ownership that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Ownership for government people lies at the center of the relationship between governments and the citizens. Citizens have ownership in a society, therefore they expect the government to look after them, to provide a safe working environment, because they pay tax in the system. My question is with regards to what you said, how ownership is being thrown upside down, because everyone can publish, everyone can.
Sure.
So as government people, I'd like you to perhaps shed some light on that question.
Well, I mean, I think it feeds into the idea of government as being a kind of a collective society where you have collective ownership of things. And so now, instead of having collective ownership, you have collective access to it. I think it's actually, I think the idea of collective social access is closer to a government than it is trying to hurt a bunch of people who have property rights that you're trying to manage. So I think, in a certain sense, to me, the governance itself is closer to this idea of access than, like say, a national park. Okay, so national park, I don't own a national park, it's not owned by anybody, but I have access to a national park, which is run by the government. I think what we're saying is the same thing, is that you have access to health, you have access to whatever it is without introducing the idea of ownership. So I think in the private sphere, this is more important than I think in the government, it's closer to this already. But I think in the private sphere, where people have this idea of property rights, it's my property, it's my this, that's where I think there's going to be a bigger disruption. My feeling is that the government is closer to this already. Yeah, behind you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
My question is, what's going to happen to individual intellectual property rights, and what's going to be the encouragements for people to come up with new things or to author new things in the future?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very cantankerous. I don't think people are going to easily surrender the idea of property rights. But I think what's happening is what we see in the copyright world, where people realize that the idea of protecting a copy just doesn't work. And so it was a technological reality that they had to kind of, it wasn't because they were thinking ahead, it was simply because it wasn't working the other way. And I suspect that this change and shift away from ownership is not going to, it's going to happen against the wishes of people rather than realizing it. So I think, to answer your question, I think it's going to be a friction-laden legal process for 20, 30 years. And I think what will help is understanding that what we normally assign as property is a, I should say, is a temporary state. So the way I think of like say, digital creation is that it's born into the commons. Like when you have an idea, at that moment that idea is basically owned by everybody. But that the government can give a temporary monopoly to that to encourage you. But it should be very, very temporary. Right now in the digital world, or copyright world, we have like 70 years plus lifetime. This is crazy. Just not really incenting anybody. So I think we're going to have the same thing even with the physical world, where the uses of giving the monopoly of ownership is going to be much more constricted. And I think generally we understand that things are born into the commons and die in the commons, and they have a very moment where we have ownership, including maybe even land or other stuff, physical things. If we shift this idea that the basic native home for an idea or anything intangible is in the commons, and that we take it out of the commons in a very special, limited way, and then it comes back into the commons very fast. So that I think is going to be that's so different from what we have now. It almost sounds like communism, but I think it's going to take many, many generations for that to really work its way out.
Yeah. Mr. Kevin, we
yeah.
have one last question.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you for the great presentation. You're talking about a revolution within a revolution within a revolution, all of that. Now, we have the traditional track of educational system, medical system, and all these traditional systems. Also the government system, the government planners and policymakers. So what's your advice regarding incorporating such revolution in the educational system for youngsters, for professionals, so that they are better equipped to deal with these things?
Yeah, so I have several answers to that. I think it depends on the age. I think very young people, I think most of what happens in school is really not about information, it's about character, developing character. Just basic life skills and literacy. And there, I think technology does not play as big a role as it does later on in life. I think I preach something called technological literacy. So just as we take 4 or 5 years of really hard work to learn how to read, it's going to take us maybe 4 or 5 years to learn how to deal with technology. I don't think we should just assume that people can learn it by hanging around about technology. I think you can't learn how to read just by hanging around a book. It actually takes some deliberate practice. And I think it's going to take us some deliberate training about how to understand technology and use it. And I think, like, for instance, there are lots of lessons that we need to teach about technology and critical thinking. And I think that can happen at the level, and I think that can be assisted by technology. But the role of technology increases over time, and I think that the work that we're now doing is very important, but in the lower grades, I'm not so keen on putting a lot of high-tech technology in the classroom. I think that's a little misguided in terms of money. I think better teachers and personal face-to-face is much more valuable at the younger age. As you get older, I think then we can imagine distributed learning on websites, all this kind of stuff. I think they become hugely important. I just want to make a distinction between the ages. So young, I think better teachers is where the money is. And as you get older, college, higher ed, I can imagine hugely impacted by this. But I like what the X Prize is doing, which is having an award for developing a particular app or program as a way of making this work. If you know, X Prize is a $10 million prize for the people who can come up with a phone app to help people read. So phones, people who have Africa, they don't have much, but they may have a phone. If they have access to a phone, they can actually use the phone to learn to read. There's a $10 million prize for developing that technology to prove that they can actually do that. That, I think, is a great way, a great model for instigating some changes, making it an X Prize kind of a prize for things. So I think there's a little bit of an infatuation with the latest stuff in education. So I would go a little slow there in terms of investing, but I do think there is great potential. The lower grades, I think, better paid teachers would make a huge difference.
Thank you.
Yes.